Dual controller architectures feel like they're as old as the universe. They've been around since forever, and they are getting a bit long in the tooth, but they're still really common, especially in the lower end of the market and maybe the mid-range market. And to be honest, they still serve a function. We won't be seeing them go away anytime soon. Let's look at our box that we built into a storage array earlier and remind ourselves of what a dual controller array looks like. A critical point on dual controller architectures is that you can't add another 2 controllers and make this a 4 controller system. You can only add more drives and maybe sometimes more cache. This is a major limitation of dual controller architectures in many respects. And we call this ability to add more drives to a system either vertical scaling or scale up. Anyway, as the name suggests, a dual controller architecture consists of 2 and no more than 2 controllers, and they work together as a single active-active pair. And by active-active, we mean that both are processing I/O at the same time, but critically, they are never processing I/O for the same LUN or volume at the same time. And let's take a look at a few pictures to show how this works. In our picture we have a dual controller array with a single volume, volume 0. This volume is accessible via both controllers, but controller A owns the volume, and it's the only controller that will write to the volume. We say that it's active for volume 0. Controller B, on the other hand, has a passive connection to the volume. Now let's add a second volume, volume 1. This time controller B is active for the volume and controller A is passive. If either controller were to fail, the surviving controller would become active for both volumes. And this type of configuration does scale. We've just added another 2 volumes and we've configured them in the same way, so that each controller is active for half of our volumes. And this is a crude attempt at evenly balancing the workload across both of our controllers. And it's crude because really we've got no idea how busy each of those volumes actually is. Volumes 0 and 2 could be really busy, whereas volumes 1 and 3 could be relatively idle, and this would make controller A work much harder than controller B. Nonetheless, this is a common practice seen in the real world, and in fact many companies with dual controller architectures, they tend to allocate odd-numbered volumes to one controller and even-numbered volumes to the other controller. It's crude, but it does tend to work. In this way, both controllers are active, they're just not active for the same volume at the same time. Technically speaking, we call this asymmetrical logical unit access, or ALUA for short. And as logical unit is just another term for volume, by saying asymmetrical logical unit access, we're in effect saying asymmetrical volume access. And this approach is fine, but prone to uneven workload balance as we mentioned. Now it also comes unstuck if one of our controllers fails. Sure, the other controller can access all of the physical drives on the back end, and it can become active for all of the LUNs and volumes that were active on the now failed controller. But while that might look good and sound simple, let's say that both controllers were 80% busy before controller A failed. Now, controller B suddenly has to take on the workload of controller A, and 80% plus 80% is 160%. All of a sudden, and without any warning, controller B is a whole lot busier than it was before, and of critical importance, it's a whole lot busier than it was ever designed to be. Controller B can obviously only operate at 100%, leaving us a shortfall of 60% in this instance. Clearly, this will have a severe impact on the overall performance of all hosts attached to our storage array. So while a dual controller configuration may appear on the outside to be highly available with no single point of failure, and technically speaking it is, in reality we might be pushing our array too hard to be able to cope seamlessly with failures. And if performance gets so bad, it can be the equivalent of a system down. Let's also mention cache and why it's of paramount importance that cache is non-volatile. For performance reasons, when a host issues an I/O to a storage array, the array will issue an acknowledgement, known as an ACK, to the host as soon as the data arrives and is mirrored in cache. This is because writing to cache is unbelievably faster than getting that write all the way back to disk on the back end. However, Most caches are implemented as DRAM caches, and DRAM loses its contents when the power is taken away. And if this ever happened, you lost power and lost the contents of your cache before it was written to disk. Your application would think that it had written data to its volume, but the storage array would have lost that data. We refer to this as a data loss scenario, and it is the worst place that a storage administrator can be in. Imagine if that data was a financial transaction. Let's say, for instance, you'd made a lump sum payment to pay off your mortgage, and the array lost all record of that payment. I imagine you'd be none too happy. So in order to prevent this scenario from ever happening, storage arrays include batteries that provide power to the DRAM cache in the event that mains power is ever lost. And depending on the array and the batteries being used, the array will use the power from the batteries to either keep power to the DRAM during the power loss, or they'll use the power to keep the array running for a short period of time, during which it can destage the contents of cache to disk. And this power failure could be as simple as a failed power supply unit in your array if you only had a single power supply unit in it, or if the other power supply unit had already failed. Now, of course, there are other ways that cache can fail other than power failure. Hardware failure is another obvious way, and batteries can't help you here. So to avoid losing data if your cache DIMMs fail, most arrays mirror cache. That is, they keep 2 copies of every write in 2 separate cache DIMMs, and these mirror copies are kept physically isolated. That is, one of the DIMMs in the mirror will be in controller A, and the other DIMM in the mirror will be in controller B. This way, if we lose either of our controllers for whatever reasons, you'll still have a surviving copy of your cache, and that works well for protecting data. However, if for whatever reason you do lose one side of your cache, let's say the copy in controller A in our dual controller example, the array will no longer be able to mirror protect new writes that come into cache, because one half of the cache is lost. In this situation, and in order to ensure data integrity, the array switches to operate in what is known as write-through mode. And write-through mode is when the ACK is not issued to the host until data is committed to disk on the back end. And committing data to disk on the back end takes a whole lot longer than committing it to cache. So if your array ever does have to switch to operate in write-through mode, performance will fall off a cliff. Fortunately though, once the mirrored cache is fixed, the array can move back into what is called write-back mode. And write-back mode is where the ACK is issued to the host when data is successfully mirrored to cache. So cache is vital to the performance of your storage array, and you always want to be operating in write-back mode. Let's just summarize some of what we've learned about dual controller arrays. Dual controller arrays can have a maximum of 2 controllers and are sometimes referred to as modular arrays or mid-range arrays. Mid-range because they tend to be very popular for small to medium-sized organizations. They provide high availability, HA, due to them having component redundancy. Basically, they've got 2 of everything, so they can technically survive losing 1 of everything. They have no hardware single point of failure. And some components are hot swappable, meaning that they can be replaced without having to power down the system. In fact, it's usually possible to swap out an entire controller while the system remains up and running. Mid-range arrays advertise themselves as being active-active, but under the hood, only one of the 2 controllers can be active for any one particular volume at any point in time. We call this mode of operation Asymmetrical Logical Unit Access, or ALUA for short. And finally, cache is mirrored, implemented as battery-backed, and operates in write-back mode as long as the batteries are working and both sides of the mirror are present and working. Now let's move on and look at grid or scale-out architectures.